Welcome to Professor Pincushion. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how you can use the pivot method in order to alter your commercial patterns to make the hip area of the patterns smaller for a more custom fit. Now let me show you what you're going to need in order to make these alterations. To make our alterations, we're going to need the following items. First, you're going to need some paper, so this is what we're going to use in order to transfer our alterations to. You're going to need the back of the pattern envelope that has the body measurements. You need your pattern pieces that you're going to alter. You need some straight pins, and then you need two different color markers. I have a black and I have a red. You don't have to use these specific colors, just two different colors. The first thing you're going to want to do is flip over the back of the pattern envelope and consult the body measurements, because these measurements are going to dictate what size you're going to do. So let's say in my example, I want to do a size 16 because the bust fits perfectly, the waist fits perfectly, the hips are a little bit too big. So this is saying it's for a 40-inch circumference, the fullest part of the hips. And in my particular case, my hips are 38. So what we're going to do is take the difference between these two numbers, so 38 compared to 40, and we're going to do a calculation to see how much we need to do our alteration for in the hips area. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to write down what the pattern hip circumference is. So this is for whatever size you're doing. You're going to look at the body measurements for hip, and for size 16 in my example, it was 40 inches. Then you're going to write down what your actual hip circumference is. So for my example, let's say it's 38. You're going to subtract these two numbers and you're going to get, well, in my case, 2 inches. So whatever this number is, you're going to divide it by 4. And that equals a 1/2 inch. Now the reason why we're dividing it by 4 is because you have the front skirt or pants and the back skirt or pants. So whatever one of those, you have the front and you have the back. There's 2 side seams on each one of those, so that equals 4 sides that we're going to be subtracting a 1/2 inch. So whatever this number is for you, this is going to be your magic number, and this is what we're going to use to decrease on our pattern for our alteration. Once you have your calculation done, now we can start prepping for our alteration. So here I have my pattern that I'm going to be doing it on. It's a good idea just to kind of press it as best you can so it's a little flatter. Don't use a really hot iron, instead use a cool iron or a slightly warm iron. So it's not going to get all the wrinkles out, but at least it'll look a little bit better. So once you have that, you're then going to get a piece of paper and put underneath, and I like using some tracing paper. And you can see that I'm not covering the whole pattern. So it's a little bit longer lengthwise than my pattern, but it probably goes to about here underneath my pattern, because we're only going to be working on the side seam section here. The center back side or the center front side, we're not going to do anything with. So we don't need paper here, we just need it right here. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to lay out your paper, and you'll notice I like doing it on a cardboard because I just use my straight pins as push pins, and that was a little bit easier for me to pivot everything around instead of using tape. So I pin my paper down to my cardboard, and then I have my pattern on top of that. So once I have it laid out and pinned, I'm going to go ahead and use my black marker and trace around my pattern the part that is on my tracing paper here. So once you have it all outlined, then we'll start marking where we're going to make our alteration. When doing our alteration, we need to mark out where our pivot points are going to be on our pattern. So to do that, the first thing you're going to do is make note of where the waistline is. So luckily on my pattern, even though it's backwards, it says waistline and then it has a line. So I'm going to make sure that I extend this line to this edge because it's the side that I'm going to be working with. And from this line, I'm going to mark in my seam allowance. You can see my little red mark here. So I do 5/8 of an inch because that's my seam allowance. If your particular pattern doesn't have a waistline mark, it's usually going to be the length of your seam allowance. So 5/8 of an inch down should be where your waistline is going to be. So I already have it, so I don't have to worry about it, and I just mark it down here and then come in 5/8 of an inch and mark it with my red marker. Now the second pivot line is going to be the hip line. So to find that, you can also look on your pattern to see if it says hip with a line. If it does, then great. You can just continue the line just like you did with the waistline. If it doesn't, like mine does not have that printed on it, you need to do a little bit more investigation. So I consult the back of my pattern envelope, and on the back where it says body measurements, there'll be hip, and sometimes it'll say the distance the hip is from the waist. So in this particular case, it would be 9 inches. So once I have that, I can come back to my pattern, measure down for my waistline 9 inches, and then make another line. So that's going to be my hip line. Now, if it doesn't say on your pattern and it doesn't say on your envelope, you can figure that the average length distance between the hip and the waist is 7 to 9 inches. So you can measure on yourself from your natural waistline to the fullest part of your hips and see where it lies. Or you could just play it safe and just do 9 inches. You'll notice though that it's more narrow up here at the waistline, and then as it gets to the hip line, it becomes wider. So the hip line is usually the widest part. Once you have your hip line, you're going to do the same thing where from this edge you're going to come in your seam allowance and you're going to make another red mark. So here I have my 5/8 of an inch. So once you have that, since we're in this area, all I'm going to do is mark on my page right where I have my black outline where the hip line is, just so I know where it is. Because what I'm going to do next is I'm going to move this pattern a little ways out of the way, and you're going to take your measurement that you got from your calculation. So in my example, I'm doing a 1/2 inch. So right here where I have my hip line, I'm going to mark in a 1/2 inch with my red marker. So that's going to be our first change that we're going to make. Down here at the bottom of my hemline, I'm going to do the same thing. So I'm just going to move my pattern out of the way. I'm going to measure in whatever my calculation was, again a 1/2 inch, and I'm going to make another red mark. So with my pattern back in the original spot along the black line, I'm going to take a straight pin and I'm going to put it in my pivot mark. So this is on the waistline where you went in for your seam allowance and you made your red mark. I'm removing all my other straight pins from my pattern. So once my straight pin is in this pivot mark here, I am going to pivot my pattern until my hip line, the side seam at the hip line, meets the red dot that I made when I went in a 1/2 inch or whatever measurement you went. Stick in some straight pins, and then I'm going to use my red marker and I'm going to trace from the hip line up to the waistline. So from here to the top, I'm just going to trace along my pattern. Keeping your pattern where it is on the red line, you're then going to take another straight pin and you're going to put it on your pivot mark on the hip line. So that's going to be my other red mark. I'm going to remove all other straight pins. And now I'm going to move my pattern back until this bottom portion meets up with the red mark I made down here on the hemline. Once it meets, I can go ahead, stick in a straight pin, and now I'm going to trace along the outside from the hemline up to my hip line. I'm going to replace my pattern so it lines back up with the black line. And you can go ahead and tape this area so the tracing paper is now attached to the pattern. And you notice that I actually put the pattern underneath the tracing paper, so that way I can see both sets of lines. I can see the black and I can see the red, and the red is going to be my new side seam. But the tracing paper also makes it handy because I can still read all the information on my pattern, any darts, marks, all that kind of stuff. So that part still is maintained. So when I'm ready to cut this out after it's taped, I'm going to cut along the black line until I get to the red line, which is the new side seam, and I'm going to cut this till it tapers back up to the waistline. So all this is going to get cut off of my pattern because we're taking it in so the hip line now fits a little better. So if you're a little unsure about cutting up your pattern because you don't know if it's going to work, all you can do is, if this was a pattern, just fold it under so it goes past this, and then you're just going to use this as your new edge. So that way, if it doesn't work, you can still bring out your pattern and then try it again. So I'm going to go ahead, tape this, and then cut it out, and then this alteration is complete. Make sure to check out our other videos and visit ProfessorPincushion.com to view our complete library with well over 100 sewing video tutorials. New tutorials are released regularly, so make sure to subscribe to be notified of the next release. Thanks for watching!